Natural disasters are continuing in China as earthquakes hit Tibet and Xinjiang. Floods as well as droughts sweep the country. The UK calls out China for its extensive human rights abuses, especially in relation to Uyghurs and the situation in Hong Kong. And former member of China's internet police reveals CCP's social media censorship operations. Hey, welcome back everyone. First off, on July 21st, earthquakes hit in Tibet and Xinjiang. There was a 4.1 magnitude earthquake in Bomi County of Linzhi city of Tibet, and a 3.6 magnitude earthquake in Yutian County of Xinjiang. This was followed by another 4.1 earthquake also in Bomi County of Tibet. In Enshi of Hubei, meanwhile, a landslide formed a natural dam at the upper reaches of the Xinjiang River, and authorities are warning it could break at any moment. The flood control and drought relief headquarters of Enshi City, Enshi Prefecture in Hubei Province issued an early warning that people in the path of the dam should prepare to evacuate. And as the floods and natural disasters continue, not one of the 7 top members of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo Standing Committee has appeared at a major disaster site. And as NTD News is reporting, this is a break from standard protocol, given that typically top CCP leaders would be using disasters like this for propaganda, such as for photo opportunities at the front lines of fighting these floods, for example, so they can later use these appearances to say they declared victory over the disasters. And meanwhile, as floods continue in southern and central China, in the north, China is facing droughts. And this, combined with locusts, is heightening the risk of food shortages. Many areas currently being hit by floods and droughts are among China's top regions for growing grains. For rice farmers, for example, local reports are saying they had almost no harvest in the early season and substantially reduced harvests in the mid and late seasons. Now, the CCP has been claiming otherwise. The Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs of the CCP issued a document on July 16 stating this, quote, "Our country had a boosted harvest of summer grains. The planting area of major food crops is basically stable, and the stocks of rice and wheat are sufficient, roughly equivalent to the annual consumption of the people of the country." Now, people on the ground are saying otherwise. A farmer from Poyang County, for example, in Jiangxi Province, told the Epoch Times in an interview, quote, "Early season rice basically has no harvest." Now, normally this would be harvested in mid to late July. He said the annual mid-season rice, which is usually planted in May and harvested in September, is, quote, "supposed to be on the growth stage at this time. But with this ongoing flood, the production is drastically reduced. There's basically no hope. CCP media said on TV that we have a boosted harvest. This is a lie. Summer crops cannot be harvested. This is for sure." And in addition to this, a farmer in Hunan told the Epoch Times, quote, "This year's floods have affected many areas in more than a dozen provinces. In many places, there was basically no harvest. The CCP saying there's a boosted harvest is not believable." And meanwhile, with the droughts, wheat fields are similarly failing. In Inner Mongolia, crops have been growing poorly, and branches of leaves are wilting. According to Ordos Meteorological Observation, as of early June, most areas of the city were having severe droughts, and spring planting and pasture grading were adversely affected. And in Gansu Province, similarly, in recent years, it has normally experienced winter droughts, spring droughts, late spring and early summer droughts, and summer droughts. Now, Chinese news outlets reported in June that the continuous drought in Gansu this year has caused a substantial reduction in crop production, such as with wheat and corn and flax, due to these droughts. And in other news, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued a statement on July 20 and called on the CCP to end its persecution of Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, on the day marking 21 years since the Chinese Communist Party's campaign of arrest, torture, re-education through labor, and live organ harvesting began. Pompeo said this, quote, "We call on the PRC government, the People's Republic of China, to, quote, immediately end its depraved abuse and mistreatment of Falun Gong practitioners, release those imprisoned due to their beliefs, such as Ma Zhenyu, and address the whereabouts of missing practitioners. 21 years of persecution of Falun Gong practitioners is far too long, and it must end." Also, 2 Chinese hackers have been indicted in Washington. The Department of Justice released states that the 2 hackers were stealing information, including intellectual property and research on the new coronavirus, the CCP virus. It states the hackers are being charged for, quote, hacking into the computer systems of hundreds of victim companies, governments, non-governmental organizations, and individual dissidents, clergy, and democratic and human rights activists in the United States and abroad, including Hong Kong and China. Now, the individuals worked for the Guangdong State Security Department, the GSSD, of the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, which is China's equivalent of kind of the FBI combined with the CIA. And it says they were also running operations for personal profit. And now for the broader stories for today. As the United States has moved to sanction CCP officials for their abuses of Muslim Uyghurs, the United Kingdom is also now calling out the Chinese Communist Party in this regard. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said this in an interview with BBC on July 19.
But the fact is, whatever the legal label, it is clear that there are gross, egregious human rights abuses are going on, which is why in New York, in Geneva at the UN, we raised this with 27 partners. First time it's been done to call out the government of China for its human rights abuses of the Uyghurs, also Hong Kong.
Now, Uyghurs who had been detained by the CCP told the Epoch Times in previous interviews that they were subjected to torture, were forced to denounce their religion, were forced to pledge their loyalty to the CCP, among other things. Many of them are sent to re-education through labor camps, similar to the Soviet Gulag system, where many have also been drugged or killed by the Chinese Communist Party. And Uyghur women are also subjected to forced sterilization and forced abortion. And so the broader picture here, other countries are beginning to get behind the United States now as it calls out the Chinese Communist Party for its abuses of its own people, for its abuses of human rights, including of ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs and Tibetans. The Chinese Communist Party typically keeps other countries from criticizing it in these regards. If you bring up some of these topics like the Uyghurs, like the persecution of Falun Gong, like democracy in Hong Kong, for example, they will push back against you. Sometimes they will walk out of negotiations. And because the CCP treats these issues in these ways, these are no-go topics for the CCP, a lot of countries typically will not even touch them. They will typically not criticize the CCP on these grounds. And instead they believe, at least in the past, in engaging in acceptable diplomacy with the CCP because they thought it was better than nothing. Well, we're seeing the opposite happening now, where in many countries in the world we're seeing strong pushback against the CCP, and countries are no longer afraid of calling out the Chinese authorities, the Chinese Communist Party authorities, for their abuses of their own people, for torture, for gulag systems, for re-education through labor, and other crimes against humanity, which have been going on for decades with very little pushback. Also, a former member of China's internet police has come forward to reveal the CCP's censorship operations on major Chinese social media platforms. The individual named Lu Lipeng spoke with the Epoch Times about his former work, and he has immigrated now to California, meaning he can speak freely. Now, he worked for 2 years filtering content on Weibo, which is a Chinese social media platform that's kind of similar to Twitter, and also spent 4 years as a manager for censorship on Linzhi, which is similar to YouTube. Now, Epoch Times reported this. Lu described the role of content reviewers or moderators in China as labor-intensive and high-stress positions that were closely watched and controlled by the central government's chief censorship agency, the Cyberspace Administration. Now, he said the CCP has party branches in all of China's social media offices, and said this, quote, "We all know who the party members are in our offices, and they usually are very friendly to everyone. They never tell you what to do. But on the important issues, they will speak loudly about what they believe, and that's the official stance." So a few points on this. First off, this shows that the Chinese Communist Party closely manages what can or cannot be said on social media platforms in China, and individual companies themselves even have assigned individuals in charge of these things. In other words, this means that the Chinese Communist Party is closely managing all these different platforms. You might see these platforms saying, oh, we don't censor content, oh, we don't cooperate with authorities. This absolutely contradicts that. These companies, as part of their agreement, as part of the way they can operate in China, they need to work with the CCP because if they don't, they violate the law. The Chinese Communist Party closely monitors the types of information and the censorship practices at these companies. And as we see here, they even assign individuals who go to these companies and work there and who basically set the tone and standards of what can or cannot be said. Now, this individual also said he interviewed for a job at ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, for a job monitoring and policing videos posted by international users. But he said he was turned down from that job after saying Americans would be unhappy if they saw their content get censored. Now, he said during a field trip to the company's headquarters, they walked him around in circles in the building and instructed him while they walked him around to not look around. Now, he said, quote, "You may as well put a black cover over my eyes. It felt like visiting the den of a drug lord." And he said the company, ByteDance, is, quote, "directly censoring American speech." Now, a few points on this. Now, TikTok has been trying to get away from the idea that it might censor different users. There has been evidence that it's censoring users, including Americans. There have been cases of this, for example. And there are cases of it censoring different content, for example, around Hong Kong, when it comes to backing the CCP's interest on these things. You might remember a previous episode, I did more of an in-depth dive into ByteDance as well, the company that runs TikTok. And one of the most interesting things, at least in my analysis, is that the head of ByteDance, so again, this company that runs TikTok, actually published a public self-criticism letter going back to 2018 where he apologized to the Chinese Communist Party and to the Chinese people, again under the CCP, for not following the regulations of the CCP closely enough. Now, when it comes to the Communist Party, this is common practice. If you go against party directives, they will make you do self-criticisms like this. So he criticized himself for not closely following the CCP. And in that same letter, he said that he was going to do trainings for his different staff members and also start working more closely to support the different directives of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to promoting the interests of the CCP through these platforms. Part of that, among many other things, was supporting the CCP's directives on supporting, quote, core socialist values, and also pushing Xi Jinping's different agendas when it comes to messaging. And so while TikTok again claims it does not follow the directives of the CCP well, the person in charge of the company came out himself in 2018 and promised that he would do so, promised to the CCP. And there's a lot of controversy around TikTok because they're being accused of doing things just like this. And on the broader perspective of this, why does the Chinese Communist Party censor the internet? Why do they feel the need to have these censors at different offices of these different social media companies? Why are they afraid of allowing open debate and open discussion? Why is it in China that, for example, people don't know about the Tiananmen Square massacre a lot of times? Why is it that foreign tech companies will even oftentimes cooperate with them when it comes to censoring information like this? Well, it's because the Chinese Communist Party can't stand the light of day. When it comes to its different abuses of the Chinese people, the Chinese Communist Party has taken every measure it possibly can to prevent them from knowing the truth of these situations. It has done everything in its power to prevent this type of information from getting out. And the CCP has massive, massive systems to prevent open debate. You might remember in a previous episode, just for the censorship of Xi Jinping, when it comes to preventing people from criticizing the party leader, they have more than 35,000 different keywords that are censored. And so the Chinese Communist Party is very, very aggressive with censorship. And at least in my analysis, this is a clear sign. Again, they see it as a threat to its leadership. They see open debate and the free flow of information as being threats to their power. And why would those be threatening to you? And why would a country see the free flow of information as being a threat to its power? It's told people narratives that can't stand open discourse. In other words, it cannot win an argument on these grounds. And it's afraid that if open discourse were to take place, that the result of that would go against the interests of the party itself. And that should be something very telling. And also the CCP censorship does not just impact China. You might have seen the NBA, for example, bowing to Chinese censors. You might have seen different cases of U.S. journalists getting kicked out of China for violating the CCP's different rules when it comes to reporting. You might have seen many cases, for example, of academics and researchers being kicked out of China for not following the CCP's different narratives on its different programs. Well, what's the bigger picture of this? The Chinese Communist Party is part of the deal of doing business with China, as part of the deal of reporting in China, and as part of the deal of conducting research with China, forces different individuals to abide by its standards on censorship. If you go against those standards, you will get kicked out of the country. It's This is why, for example, why Epoch Times is blacklisted in China. We refuse to bow down to their censors. And we see this issue now coming to the forefront, where the Chinese Communist Party is no longer able to keep information suppressed like it used to. There are criticisms against the CCP coming from every direction now. Many of the institutions and individuals who typically did support the CCP, some of them are still supporting them and backing them, but it is no longer in vogue to do so. There is a larger, say, international criticism growing against the CCP. There are grassroots movements like the Tweedong or Quit the Party movement that is quietly disintegrating the CCP. And there are many individuals like we see in Hong Kong, like we see in Taiwan, who are no longer afraid of calling out the Chinese Communist Party and standing up against the Chinese Communist Party. And we can see the effects of its different censorship methods now also clear as day. Where, for example, if NBA censors individuals on behalf of the CCP, it becomes an international scandal. Many of these things are now coming to the forefront. Now, in other news, suspected CCP political influence is now being exposed in New Zealand in its two main parties. 3 suspects are facing trial for donations to the country's National Party and for links to funding to its Labour Party. These are again the 2 main political parties in New Zealand. And so with a broader picture of this, the Chinese Communist Party does operations like this, political warfare operations and influence operations in most countries, including, say, the Five Eyes countries, New Zealand, Australia, UK, Canada, the United States. They are extremely aggressive with this in many countries. You might remember the Sidewinder report in Canada, actually more than a decade ago now. A report came out from the Canadian intelligence agencies warning that the Chinese Communist Party had gained influence over different politicians in the country, and also talked about the different operations the CCP had to infiltrate and subvert the country. That was called out. Now, a lot of pushback was made against that, for example, because it was called racist. And that was a clear example of one of the CCP's main strategies: strangle you with your own systems. They look for, say, weaknesses within the country's culture, weaknesses within the country's common forms of debate, and they exploit those weaknesses. It is easy to say you cannot criticize me because doing so is racist. And that's exactly what the CCP did in Canada. It's exactly what they do in a lot of different countries. But the issue of political influence and the CCP controlling different politicians came to the forefront in Canada during that time. And that issue now has become an international discussion. We see, for example, in Australia, the Chinese Communist Party is being called out for influencing its politics as well. And there are many different politicians in Australia who are being called out for having these ties. And even in the United States, this is becoming an issue as well, where different politicians or their family members are found to have ties financially to the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, there is concern in the United States right now that different U.S. officials may have illicit ties to the CCP. And a big question now is what is given in exchange for these different benefits. If they did in fact receive these things in exchange for something, what did they give in exchange for that? Well, we could be looking at something very serious here, where politicians in many countries of the world have betrayed their own people on behalf of a foreign hostile government. They have betrayed their own people on behalf of the CCP, and they've sold out the interests of their own people to a foreign government. This has happened in many countries. We've known this has happened in many countries. The big question is how prevalent is this issue, and for example, has it been taking place in the United States, and to what extent? We do have cases of this. There have been cases of it. We see it happening now in U.S. academia. We see it happening now in USA research and development. And based on my research, different things I've been working on and exposing over the years, the full picture of this is massive. On the broader picture of this, when it comes to the CCP, they have 2 different branches of their government dedicated to this. One is the General Political Department, the Liaison Department under the Chinese military. They have a military department dedicated to political warfare. Many of those operations work through a government branch that also focuses on ideological subversion and influence operations at the political level and at the social level of different countries. That is the CCP's United Front Work Department. In other words, this government department, which openly infiltrates a lot of different, say, countries and operates a lot of times openly even through their consulates and embassies. For example, if you go to the New York Consulate General website of the Chinese Communist Party, you can find the Liaison Department and the United Front Work Department listed there. Again, this is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military working through the, say, influence branch, the ideological subversion branch of the Chinese government operating openly on American soil. And they use these, same basic structures in just about every country, including in Australia, including in Canada, including in New Zealand. Now, in other news, Japan has revealed 87 projects that could receive funds for pulling out manufacturing from China. Now, they'll be receiving a total of 70 billion yen, or around $653 million, combined, to move supply chains out of China. 57 of these projects will be moving to Japan, and the rest will be heading to other countries. And this is a big deal. This shows that Japan is holding up its promise to pay different companies for moving their supply chains out of China. This was in response to what we saw during the time of the virus, when this pandemic was hitting many parts of the world. Still is to an extent, of course. But during the height of this, when countries could no longer manufacture, set products, for example in Japan, high-tech products, because their supply chains were locked up in China, and they saw the threats of China to their own national security and their own economic survival. Some countries, Japan for example, and India for example, began paying companies, at least saying they would pay companies, to pull their companies and supply chains out of China. We now see Japan following through on this. And this could be part of a larger phenomena. Again, India has promised to do the same thing, to pay companies to move out of China. And we also see this, for example, with the United States, where it's putting new laws into practice that start next month, as a matter of fact, that will forbid the sale of technologies to the U.S. government that have parts manufactured in China. Now, part of this is out of concern for, say, what we just saw recently, where if China closes down its borders, if it locks things down, if it decides to nationalize even American companies, like it did, for example, with these mask manufacturers, and say they cannot export to its own home country, that the CCP has power to do that, and that it did in fact do that during a very crucial time where people's lives were really on the line. The CCP cornered the market with these masks, bought up the global supply of these masks, and did so at a time when it knew how serious this virus was and had not yet warned the world. It was lying to the world, lying to the WHO even, and through the WHO also misleading the world. The US and the rest of the world saw the threat of that. And also, in other regards, the United States is recognizing possible supply chain threats. The idea, for example, that embedded technologies, things the CCP might be putting in chips, for example, could be threats to national security in the United States. And so it is now moving to ban the sale of different tech products that have parts manufactured in China to the US government. Meaning US government contracts for things like computers, for phones, and so on, can no longer have parts that were sourced from China. Which means we could see many companies pulling out of China, which means we could see these different parts manufacturers going to other countries, India for example. And if that does happen, this will be a major blow to the Chinese Communist Party. Now folks, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in. Also, we have a Patreon. If you want to support this channel, you can find the link to it in the description below. And every Sunday, I'll be doing a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. Also, folks, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about this channel. And that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.